The carriage arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day on which nothing was supposed to happen. Cecily had been in the kitchen garden since 7, pulling the last of the autumn carrots from the bed. Alexander had turned for her the previous week, her gloves caked at the fingertips, and her back pleasantly aching from the work, when she heard the wheels on the lane. The sound itself was unremarkable. Carts came up the lane, farmers' wagons, the occasional post-rider. What made her straighten was the quality of the sound, the particular weight of iron on stone, that spoke of large horses and a well-sprung body, and a distance traveled at considerable speed. She stood at the garden gate and watched it come. It was black and immense, with a crest on the door that she could not read from where she stood, and did not need to read to understand. 4 horses, matched gray, lathered from the road, a coachman in livery the color of a winter sky. 2 outriders behind, mud-splashed and watchful. Whatever this was, it had come from far away, and it had come with purpose. The crest was gold. It caught the morning light for just one moment, as the carriage slowed. And in that moment, Cecily understood, in the way the body understands before the mind will permit it, that her life was about to divide itself into a before and an after. She was, by the reckoning of every person who had mattered to her a year ago, the gardener's wife. She had rejected 6 princes to become it. She had not regretted a single morning. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when a woman stands at a garden gate with mud on her gloves and watches a royal carriage come for the man she loves, stay close. This story belongs to her. Cecily Wyndham had been the only daughter of a house that had once been considerable and had since become merely respectable, which is to say it had a name and a London season, and not much else. Her mother, Lady Dorothea, was a woman who had organized her entire adult life around the single conviction that the right marriage could restore what time and poor fortune had diminished, and that Cecily, who had her father's green eyes and her grandmother's composure, was the instrument of that restoration. Lady Dorothea was not cruel. She was simply a woman who had survived on strategy when feeling had failed her, and she had passed that survival instinct to her daughter in the form of a season's worth of careful management and one instruction, repeated in varying forms across Cecily's 3 London seasons: choose well. Cecily had tried. She had received 6 suitors of princely rank. She remembered each of them with the particular clarity reserved for things one has examined closely and decided against. Prince Leopold of Hauser, who was 42, and discussed his hunting properties for 40 minutes without once asking her opinion of anything, who looked at her the way a man looks at a chair he is deciding whether to reupholster. Prince Friedrich, who was pleasant and perfectly polished, and whose compliments landed on her with a precision that made her understand they were not about her specifically, but about any suitable young Englishwoman he might have encountered in her place. Prince Matteo, who was handsome and laughed too easily, and whose charm was so well practiced she could hear the machinery inside it. She had refused them all one by one across 3 seasons, with increasing clarity about what she was refusing, which was not rank or alliance or the safety of a connected match, but the specific quality of a man who looked at her without seeing her. The 4th prince had brought his mother to dinner and let her speak for him. The 5th had proposed without meeting her eyes. The 6th was very young and genuinely sweet, but when she tried to imagine their life as it would actually be day after day in a house together, she could not quite make it real, because he was looking at an idea of her, and she could feel the gap between the idea and herself, like a draft through a door that did not fit its frame. She had begun to wonder if being seen was simply not available to women of her station, that it was a private luxury afforded to women in novels and to women in other kinds of lives, and that her task was to choose correctly from among the men who would manage her well enough. She had met Alexander in April when he was kneeling in the rose bed behind Wyndham House, resetting the stakes that a late frost had loosened. She had been walking because she could not sleep, and the garden had seemed preferable to her mother's breakfast room, which in the morning had a quality of patient expectation that Cecily found difficult to breathe in. She had come out through the side door still in her morning dress, and gone toward the long bed where the roses were just beginning to show their first tight leaves. She had not heard him before she saw him. He was simply there, kneeling in the bed with his hands occupied, and his back to her, working with the focused quietness of a person who believed himself unobserved and did not adjust their manner for company because there was no company yet to adjust for. He had a stake in his left hand, and a length of twine in his right, and he was tying the cane with the same care one might give to a letter. She had stood for a moment watching his hands, which were careful and deliberate and entirely absorbed in what they were doing, each stake placed with the same attention, regardless of who was watching, which was, as far as he knew, no one at all. He had looked up and said simply, "Good morning," and gone back to work. She had asked him what the roses would look like in June. He had told her. Not briefly, not with the vague pleasantness of a servant managing a mistress's idle question, but with real attention to what she had actually asked. The names of the varieties, the likely color in this light, the timing of the bloom relative to the weather this spring. He spoke about growing things the way men of her acquaintance spoke about nothing, with the same easy casualness they generally reserved for the funds or the weather, and yet with a quality of absorption underneath that was entirely different from anything she had encountered in a drawing room. He was paying attention to what she said, not to how she said it, not to the shape of the morning, or the advantage of the occasion, or whether she might be won or managed, or moved toward any particular conclusion. To what she actually said, and to what it implied she actually wanted to know. She had gone back to the garden the following morning, and the morning after that. His name, he told her, was Sasha. He had come from the continent some 18 months prior. His English was exact and slightly formal and entirely without accent, which she found curious but did not press, because something in the way he looked at her when she asked questions about himself told her he was accustomed to the question, and had decided long before she arrived how much of an answer he would give. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair worn simply, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of deep water in a still place. He wore no coat while he worked, only a waistcoat over a plain linen shirt, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He never looked at her the way she was accustomed to being looked at. He looked at her the way he looked at the roses, which was to say with genuine, patient attention, as if she were a thing that had its own reality, quite apart from any use he might make of her. That distinction was, she realized by late May, the rarest thing she had ever encountered. By June, she knew she loved him. By July, she had told him so, sitting on the bench at the end of the kitchen garden in the long afternoon light, without preface, because she had decided that preface was a strategy for people who were not certain. And she was certain. He had gone very still. She watched his face through the stillness, and what she saw in it was not surprise exactly, but something more complex, a particular quality of someone receiving something they had not permitted themselves to expect. "I must tell you something first," he said. His voice was level, the words placed carefully. "And you must decide after." "Tell me then," she said. He did not tell her. Not then. He said only that there were things in his past that he had laid down deliberately, and that he wanted to be certain she understood. He came to her without credentials, without connections he would claim, without rank or name or fortune beyond the wage the estate paid him and the small amount he had saved. "I understand all of that," she said, and that is precisely why. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. He looked at her for a long moment with the deep-water eyes that she had spent 3 months trying to read, and what she saw in them was something she could not name but that made her pulse slow, rather than quicken, a kind of settled certainty, as if two things that had been separate had come to rest alongside each other in the right order. "I should still like to tell you the rest," he said. "Then tell me," she said. "After." They were married in September, quietly, in the village church, with Agnes, the housekeeper, as witness, and Lord Quinby, her father's old solicitor, managing the papers with the measured air of a man who has learned to execute the instructions of the people who employ him without commenting on those instructions. The church was cold and small and smelled of candles and old stone. Agnes wept. Lord Quinby did not. On the morning of the wedding, Alexander had come to Cecily's door with a single white rose cut from the garden, still wet from the morning, and set it in her hair with the same careful attention he gave to everything, pressing the stem gently through the arrangement so that it sat correctly without damaging the flower. She had looked at him in the glass while he did it, his hands in her hair, his face composed and focused and very near hers, and she had thought, "This is the only version of this morning I will ever want." Lady Dorothea did not attend. She had been informed and had acknowledged the information in writing, and the letter she sent was formally correct and contained 2 sentences and the distinct quality of a woman holding herself together with both hands. She had come to Cecily the night before and stood in the sitting room with her hands folded and her face arranged into the expression she used when she was working very hard not to show what she felt, and she had said, in a controlled and careful voice, "You have thrown yourself away on a man with dirt-stained hands, Cecily. 6 princes, 6, from 3 courts. And you choose the man who tends the roses." Cecily had said quietly, "I chose the man who saw me." Lady Dorothea had pressed her lips together. She looked at her daughter for a moment with an expression that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, but some third thing between them that Cecily did not have a word for. "I hope," her mother said at last, "that it is enough." She left without embracing her. The first weeks of their marriage were quiet and fine. They lived in the cottage attached to the Wyndham estate, which was modest and comfortable, its rooms lower ceiling than those she had grown up in, and its garden just outside the kitchen door rather than arranged at a formal distance. Alexander had furnished it with care, a good fire laid each evening, books on the shelves in 2 languages, a small piano against the wall that she had not known he played until she heard him one night, after she had gone to bed, very soft and careful. A piece she did not recognize, melancholy and beautiful. She did not let him know she heard. She lay still in the dark, and listened until it stopped. She learned him by accumulation, the way one learns a language not from rules but from daily use. He woke before her. He disliked waste in all its forms. He read 3 newspapers a day, and could discuss their contents in either of his languages with equal precision. He kept a locked writing case on the study shelf that he had told her plainly held private correspondence, and that she had respected without inquiry, filing it alongside all the other small things about him that did not quite fit the simple picture of a man who had always been a gardener. The command as protection she had noticed from the beginning. He did not offer comfort in the conventional form she had been taught to expect. He did not say soothing things. When she was cold, he said, "Come in by the fire." When she had not eaten, he set food in front of her and said, "Eat something." When she had been out too long in the November wind, he came to the kitchen door and said simply, "Come inside," in the level voice that was not a request. She had learned to read it correctly. The shortness of the phrase was not its coldness, but its care. He was putting everything into the action itself and trusting her to understand. She understood. She had caught him, once watching her from the garden gate when she had not known he was there. It was a morning in October, when the groom's boy, Thomas, had taken a fever, and Agnes had told her it was not her place to carry him broth, and she had gone anyway. Thomas was 12, and frightened, and she had grown up in this house and knew where the kitchen kept the good stock. She had sat with him for 20 minutes in the stable yard, told him a story about a dog she had once owned that ate the footman's hat, and watched the tension go out of his small face until he slept. She came out into the yard to find Alexander at the gate, his hands empty, watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not the attentiveness she was accustomed to from him. It was something more stripped than that, something that made him look, for just a moment, like a man who has been reminded of something he had almost succeeded in forgetting. He said nothing. He held the gate for her. That evening, he brought her tea without being asked, and sat across from her in the firelight, with a quiet about him that was not his usual quiet, and she understood in the way she had learned to understand him, that something in the afternoon had moved him, and that he was not yet ready to say what. She did not press him. If the world's verdict had stopped at Lady Dorothea, Cecily might have managed it with something like equanimity. Her mother's grief was real and she understood it, even when it chafed. The world does not limit its verdicts out of consideration for the people who must receive them. The Countess Havisham arrived in October for a dinner at the Fendrick estate, the nearest great house, and the primary social arena of that part of the country. The Countess was Prince Leopold's aunt, and had been, before Cecily's refusal, among the most confident architects of that match, and she arrived at the Fendrick dinner with the air of a woman who has had her most carefully chosen piece removed from a board, and has had 3 months to perfect her account of the error. Lord Fendrick had specifically requested that Cecily and Alexander attend, and declining would have been more pointed than appearing. The Countess placed them at the far end of the table. She waited until the second course to deliver her assessment, addressing a cluster of women to her left in the carrying tones of someone who has decided to be overheard rather than merely tolerating the possibility. She threw herself away, of course, the Countess said with a quality of regret that was very precisely calibrated. The gardener's wife. One tries to find a charitable explanation. Youthful sentiment, some kind of romantic excess. When Leopold had offered, and Friedrich and the rest, all of them men of consequence, and she refuses them for a man who tends the roses. She set her glass down with a small finality. It is simply not recoverable. Cecily looked at her plate. Alexander, beside her, had gone very still in the particular way he had, when the stillness was not absence, but its opposite. She felt his hand find hers under the tablecloth. His grip was steady and very quiet, and she felt her pulse slow from its furious hammering into something she could manage, because his hand was warm and real and present, and the Countess's voice was none of those things. He did not look at the Countess. He did not address her. He simply held Cecily's hand with a steadiness that was worth more, she decided, than a room full of polished conversation. There had been a letter in October which she had seen him receive and carry directly to his study. She had not thought much of it at the time. He received letters in other languages, and he answered them, and she did not ask. In November there were 3 more, arriving in close succession, each one carried to the study, and the door closed after. She knew they affected him. She knew it, by the particular way he came to bed on the nights after. Careful and very gentle, the way a person moves when they are carrying something they do not want to put down in the wrong place. He was never careless with her. There was in those weeks a quality of a man balancing something, measuring something, that she felt without being able to name. She began to pay attention to the things she had not asked about. The locked writing case. The piano piece he played in the dark. The way he sometimes stood in the garden in the early morning with his face tilted slightly upward, not looking at anything particular, just still, the way a man looks when he is listening to something no one else in the garden can hear. On a Thursday evening in November, he sat across from her at the cottage table after supper, and she watched him make the decision. He told her everything. His name was Alexander. That part she had known. The rest came slowly, placed with the same care he gave to all things. Prince Alexander of Veldenmoor. A small principality at the edge of the Austro-Hungarian sphere, known for its silver mines and its music, and its very old court, where his father's recent death had left the throne to him, the only son, and where the court had spent 8 months looking for him across 3 countries. He had come to England deliberately. His reason had a name, which was Elisa, and it came out of him carefully, with the specificity of something that has been thought about very precisely for a long time, and can now be said in plain terms without losing its shape. Elisa had been a young woman from a Baltic court, formally betrothed to him by his court's arrangement when she was 19 and he was 27. She had been kind, he said. He believed she had been kind. He had met her 4 times before the engagement was announced and 6 times before the fever that took her a week before their wedding. He had stood at her graveside in the spring and understood that he had not known her, that the court had arranged him a wife, and she had died, and he had grieved, not the woman, but the appalling absence of any chance to discover who she actually was, what she had thought about when she was not being a princess, what she would have said to him on an ordinary morning. He had left, not fled, he was precise about the word left, with enough money to live on for some years and a specific intention. He wanted to learn whether he was capable of choosing, and of being chosen, as a man rather than as a title. He had come to gardens, because gardens were the closest thing to honest work he had ever done. He had come to the Wyndham estate because it needed a gardener, and because the part of England it was in was far enough from London that no one who knew his face was likely to find him in it. He had not told her who he was because he needed to know she would choose him first. He needed to know it was possible to be chosen for the right reason, because Elisa had died without having had the chance to choose freely, and he had decided that no other arrangement of his life would be permitted to replicate that loss. Cecily sat with her hands folded on the table. "You were afraid," she said, "that I would choose you because of the title." "I was afraid," he said, "that you would choose correctly, that you would think of your family and your position, and make the sensible choice, and it would not be what I needed." "You needed to be chosen for nothing," she said. "For myself," he said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. The fire had burned low, the room was very quiet, and the quality of the quiet was the kind that occurs after a thing of weight has been said, and has settled into the space it was always going to occupy. She went to bed without answering him. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind in the garden and the low settling of the fire in the next room, and she was not angry in the way she had anticipated, which was its own kind of disturbing. She had expected anger. The specific anger of a woman deceived, something she could name and move through. Instead, what she found was something colder and more frightened, a stone behind her sternum that sat very still when she tried to examine it. She had expected to be angry about the deception itself. The title kept from her, the name withheld, the writing case with its locked correspondence and its letters in other languages, arriving in October and November, while she sat in the cottage and believed herself a woman who had simply chosen well. She had expected that to be the wound, but when she pressed at it, honestly in the dark, with the wind on the glass and his careful quiet somewhere in the next room, she found that the deception was not what frightened her. What frightened her was the question that sat underneath everything else. Had she been chosen, or had she been used as a kind of test, a proving ground for a theory he was working out about what kind of man he was capable of being? Was she the woman he loved, or was she the woman he had needed in order to discover that loving was possible? The distinction mattered more than she had words for. She was not afraid of being a prince's wife. She was afraid of being a prince's proof. She pressed her face into the pillow, and she did not sleep for a long time. And when she did sleep, she dreamed of the rosebed in April, his hands careful on the stakes, his face turned away from her, the particular quality of a man who believes no one is watching and does not change for company. Agnes came to her the next morning while Alexander was out, setting a cup of tea at her elbow, with the practiced tenderness of a woman who has served long enough to know when it is needed and how to offer it without making it a question. "There is talk," Agnes said. She stood near the kitchen door in the way she had, not sitting down, not intruding further than the information required. "In the village." The baker's girl heard from the post-rider that a foreign carriage has been on the Wyndham Lane twice in the past week. "They are saying in the shops, miss, that you threw yourself away, that the foreign gentleman was pretending at something, and that whatever comes next will prove it." "The carriage has not come yet," Cecily said. "No," Agnes said, "but it will." She poured more tea. "That is what the talk says." Cecily sat with her cup growing cold, and thought about the white rose pressed in the back of the small green book on the bedroom shelf. She had put it there the morning after the wedding, when it had dried, tucking it carefully between 2 pages of poetry that she had not read in months. She had not been certain then why she was keeping it. She was certain now. He had given her that rose as Sasha, as a gardener, as a man who had nothing to offer but the thing growing in the only garden he had ever genuinely owned. He had been afraid she would not want it if she knew the rest of what he was, and that fear, she understood sitting at the kitchen table with the tea cooling in her hands, was not manipulation, it was grief. It was the grief of a man who had watched someone die without having been permitted to know her, who had decided that the only answer to that kind of loss was to make the next choice clean. She pulled the sheet of paper toward her and wrote him a letter. It did not take long. She was not a woman who required many words for what she meant. She told him she understood why he had kept the secret, that she could see the shape of why, even if she was not yet at peace with it. She told him that when she looked honestly at what she felt for him, she could find no moment in which she had been loving an idea rather than a man. No moment in which the man she had sat with at the cottage table and listened to in the dark was not the same man who had stood in the rosebed on that April morning. She told him that if the court's expectation was his return and a proper royal match, she would not stand in his way. She wanted him to be free. She loved him. She placed the letter under the pressed white rose on the bedroom shelf and went back to the kitchen garden. The carriage arrived 2 hours later. She was still at the gate. When it came, she had not gone back inside. She had stood in the kitchen garden with the trowel in her hand and done no gardening, only stood and looked at the lane and waited, because she had understood from Agnes's words that this was the morning. She watched it slow. She watched the crest catch the light. She stood in the way she had learned from him, very still, and let it come. Lord Quinby arrived at the cottage that afternoon, at Alexandra's request, and the letter from the Veldon Moor court was translated in the cottage sitting room. It was formal and lengthy, and what it said essentially was that the court required the prince's return, that his marriage to an English woman of no title was considered a private arrangement subject to renegotiation, that succession law in Veldon Moor did not recognize unilateral foreign marriages contracted without court approval, and that a royal alliance had been proposed and was waiting. Alexander listened through to the end without expression. Then he said to Lord Quinby, in the level voice he used when he was being most precise, "I should like Lady Dorothea and Countess Haversham to be present when I give my answer. Can that be arranged?" Lord Quinby looked at him for a long, considering moment. "Your Highness," he said with the air of a man adjusting very rapidly to new information, "it can." They came the following morning to Wyndham House. Lady Dorothea received them in the drawing-room with the formal composure of a woman who has had one night to prepare and has used all of it. The Countess arrived separately and stood near the window with her fan held at the customary measuring height. Lord Quinby arranged the Veldon Moor documents on the writing table. The envoy from the court stood near the door, a man in formal continental dress who had the look of someone who has already privately calculated the probability of his return journey being an empty one. Cecily stood beside Alexander. She had not seen him this morning until he came to the cottage door, in clothes she did not recognize, a dark coat of a cut and fabric she had not seen in England, formal and very precise, every button done, his cravat arranged with a care that had nothing to do with the garden. He looked at her in the doorway, and she understood that he had put on what he was, what he had spent 18 months setting down, in order to decline it in front of the people who had spent the previous year deciding what she had lost by choosing him. He took her arm, and they walked to Wyndham House together. In the drawing-room, he stood at the center without moving to either side of it, without placing himself near the writing table or near the door, simply at the center with his hands at his sides and his face arranged into the composed, still expression that she had once taken for coldness and now knew as its exact opposite. He addressed the room. He said that the court of Veldon Moor had located him, which he had expected. Its letter had made its expectations clear. He wished to respond before witnesses of his wife's family and her society, so that his position should be unambiguous in both countries. The Countess's fan was very still. Lady Dorothea's hands were folded. "The court holds that my marriage requires renegotiation," Alexander said. "It does not. Cecily Wyndham married me in September in this parish. She married a man called Sasha, who worked in a garden and had no title to offer, no court, no crown, no credential of any kind beyond himself. She knew all of that, and she chose him." He paused. His voice remained level. "He chose her long before he wore a crown." 10 words. The room took them in the way a room takes a piece of information that rearranges several things at once. The Countess's fan descended by 1 inch. Lady Dorothea's hands folded in her lap tightened briefly, and then relaxed. The envoy looked at his documents and then at Alexander, and made visibly the calculation that the court had sent him after a man who was not coming back. Lord Quinby cleared his throat. "Your Highness intends," he said, with the precision of a man filing a document correctly, to remain in England as a private citizen, to formally decline the succession. "I intend," Alexander said, "to go home." He looked at Cecily. She felt the look in the center of her chest, a warmth that spread outward, that reached her hands and her face and the back of her throat, where she was holding something that was not quite tears. "Take me home," he said. "Please." She took his arm. They walked out of Wyndham House, past the portraits of Wyndhams who had organized their lives around position and propriety and the correct management of consequence, and out through the front door into the pale November morning. The air was cold and very clean. Behind them the drawing room was silent. She did not hear the Countess speak. She heard, as they reached the gravel of the drive, the soft, small sound of a fan folding closed. They walked the lane back to the cottage in silence, their arms linked, the bare trees letting the gray light through in long, pale strips. The kitchen garden was visible ahead, dark and ordered, the beds turned for winter. The cottage chimney was already smoking where Agnes had laid the fire. Alexander stopped at the garden gate. He stood looking at the beds, the rosemary still silver-green along the south wall, the bare rose canes tied and waiting, the turned earth dark from last week's rain. "I found your letter," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me you would not stand in the way of my duty, I told you. I wanted you to be free." He turned from the gate and looked at her. The morning light was flat and honest, the kind of light that shows everything as it is. His face was open in it in a way that was not habitual for him, the careful stillness he wore in company entirely absent, replaced by the expression she had seen once before at the stable-yard gate, the one she had not had a name for. She had a name for it now. "I gave you a rose on our wedding morning," he said. "From that bed you did. It was the only thing I had that was genuinely mine." He said it without self-pity, simply. As a man states a fact he has made his peace with. Everything else was the court's. The name was the court's. The title was the court's. The income, the estate, the obligations, the arrangements for my life, all of it. That garden was the only thing I had built with my own hands, in a country where no one knew what I was, and it grew what I told it to grow. I cut one rose from it and put it in your hair because I wanted to give you something true." She looked at him for a moment. "It was the best gift I have ever received," she said. He opened the gate for her. By Christmas the envoy had returned to Veldenmoor without his prince, and the court's second letter, longer and more formal than the first, had been answered by Lord Quinby with a document containing Alexander's formal written renunciation, signed in both languages, witnessed by Lord Quinby and by Cecily and by Agnes' dad, who pressed her thumb to the wax seal with the air of someone performing an action they have been waiting to perform for some time and find they are equal to. The third letter, briefer than the others, arrived in January and was answered by the same document by reference. Lord Quinby believed that would conclude the correspondence. He had been managing the Wyndham family's legal affairs for 30 years, and his confidence on such points was not easily shaken. Lady Dorothea came to the cottage in December. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the fire and the bookshelves and the piano against the wall, and her daughter sitting in the window with a book in her lap and the light falling across her hair. And then she came in and sat in the chair Cecily offered her and accepted the tea Alexander brought without meeting his eyes directly. She asked how the kitchen garden was doing. Cecily told her about the winter kale and the rosemary, which had been improbably good this year, and the roses, which Alexander believed would be exceptional in the spring if the frost did not come too hard. Lady Dorothea listened with the careful attention of a woman who is listening to something other than what is being said, and finding it not entirely unwelcome. It was not forgiveness yet. It was the shape of it beginning which Cecily understood was the only version available and was entirely sufficient. The Countess was not seen at any dinner Cecily attended for the remainder of the season. She sent a card at Christmas, correctly addressed, which meant she had asked someone who knew. The card said nothing of gardeners. The white rose was still pressed in the small green book on the bedroom shelf. Cecily had not moved it. On cold evenings she sometimes took it out and set it on the table beside the lamp, where it held its shape improbably well, a white rose from a September garden persisting into the depth of winter. One evening in January, Alexander sat at the piano and played the piece she had been hearing through the wall for months, all the way through, not quietly, not as if he believed himself alone. She sat with her hands around her cup and listened to it from the beginning to the end. It was melancholy and very beautiful, and unlike anything she had heard in an English drawing room, something with a different kind of weight in it, the weight of a country and a history she did not know yet, but had time to learn. When it ended, she asked him what it was. "Something from home," he said. "I used to play it for my mother. Will you play it again?" He played it again. The fire settled in the grate. Through the window, the garden was bare and frost silver, the rose canes dark against the pale stone wall. In the spring they would grow again. He knew how to tend them. She was learning, and learning was what the spring was for. She looked at the small white rose on the table beside the lamp, a summer thing that had survived the cold by some quality she did not fully understand, and she thought, this is what it looks like when you throw yourself away correctly. She did not say it aloud. She was not a woman who required the last word to know she had it. She reached across the table and set the rose back in its book. The piano continued. The frost pressed at the glass. She was, by every reckoning that had ever mattered, exactly where she had chosen to be. If Cecily's quiet courage moved you, leave a thought below. Stories about the women who chose without permission are why we are here.